Well, welcome to the 2018 W.D. Brooks Lecture. My name is Sam Pardue, and I have the great privilege of being the Dean and Director here in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. It is certainly my honor to welcome you here and to recognize that we have an audience that is viewing us remotely. And this is truly one of the most exciting days in the life of the college. Today we'll hear what promises to be a thought-provoking lecture. We'll be honoring outstanding College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences faculty members who carry on that tradition and legacy that W.D. Brooks established, a man who helped lay the foundation for the work that we do today. D.W. Brooks has the distinction of being both the youngest and the oldest faculty member in the history of our college. He began teaching here at the age of 19 and returned after a long career in agriculture as a visiting professor until his death at the age of 97. Think about the span that his career encompassed. He truly dedicated his entire life to this college and in improving agriculture, particularly in Georgia, but frankly throughout the South. An impressive legacy, certainly. In 1981, we established the D.W. Brooks Award to recognize faculty in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences for excellence in teaching, research, extension, public service, and international programs. The winners that will be recognized this afternoon and at a dinner this evening were nominated by their peers. They were selected by a panel of judges, and they represent some of our most noteworthy scientists, professors, and extension professionals. Today, it is my great honor to recognize the following D.W. Brooks recipients for 2018. Kenyu Jack Huang, professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences, is the winner of the D.W. Brooks Award for Excellence in Research. His research into the remediation of organic compounds in polluted soil and water has gained international attention. Carrie Turner, associate professor in the Department of Animal and Dairy Science, is the winner of the D.W. Brooks Award for Excellence in Teaching. Her focus on inspiring undergraduates has helped earn the department its excellent reputation as a student-centered place of instruction. Dan Suter, professor in the Department of Entomology, is the winner of the D.W. Brooks Award for Excellence in Extension. Dan has developed training programs for structural and urban pest management professionals that has been used throughout the Southeast and around the world. Lisa Jordan, Family and Consumer Sciences Program Development Coordinator for UGA's Cooperative Extension Southeast District, is the D.W. Brooks Award winner for Excellence in Public Service Extension. Before being appointed to her current post, Lisa spent almost 2 decades working to broaden the reach and reputation of the expanded food and nutrition education program in Chatham County. And the 2018 D.W. Brooks Award of Excellence in Global Programs winner is Yin-Kan Hung, a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology. Yin-Kan's commitment to international outreach and collaboration has helped to build a safer food system throughout the world. At this time, I would like to ask all our winners to stand and to be recognized. Well done. And now for our lecture. On behalf of the University of Georgia and the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, it is truly my honor to welcome Dr. Rob Paarlberg to our campus. Dr. Paarlberg is a noted author and an expert in agricultural development policy. He has spent many years analyzing the impacts of agricultural policy in the U.S. and in the developing world. Some of his books Titles include Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, The United States of Excess, Gluttony and the Dark Side of American Exceptionalism, and Starved for Science, How Biotechnology is Being Kept Out of Africa. He puts forth that the problems that threaten food security around the world today are complex, and that those challenges will require complex solutions. But all too often when people discuss issues like food and agriculture, they use oversimplified arguments in trying to describe what they believe should occur. Today, he'll discuss perhaps an alternative option, one that we might seek a middle ground, a place of understanding, and poses some serious questions about the way that we think about food and agriculture. Will you please help me welcome Dr. Rob Paarlberg.
Well, first, congratulations to the Brooks Award winners. It's a pleasure to be here and to watch you take the honors that you well deserve. And Sam, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also for the invitation to visit Athens, and for this opportunity to help celebrate the wonderful legacy of D.W. Brooks. I hope there is some young Georgian out there, maybe at the university already, who will live till 2099 and do for Georgia's agriculture in the 21st century what D.W. Brooks did in the 20th century. So my lecture title is Foodies versus Aggies, Compromise for a New Food System, and I picked this lecture theme because in my own professional life, I'm always moving back and forth between these two worlds. By Aggies, I mean the world of food producers, including the Indiana farmers in my own family background, and also the smallhold farmers in Asia and Africa that I work with now in much of my research and consulting. By Foodies, I'm thinking about many of the students that I teach in the Boston area. It's a world where there are almost zero farmers, but large numbers of politically engaged, quality-conscious, and deeply concerned food consumers. These two worlds are often in collision. And many of my students in the Boston area are deeply interested in agriculture, surprisingly enough. But New England is not an agricultural region, so they've had very little firsthand exposure to modern commercial farming. If you look at all of the farms, large and small, in the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, they together produce only 0.4% of all the nation's agricultural output. There are quite a few farms in New England, but they're mostly tiny, part-time operations with museum-worthy antique buildings and barns, and they're typically financed by non-farm income or retirement income, and being surrounded by such farms creates plenty of space for unrealistic thinking about what an ideal food production system might look like. For example, back in 2008, I attended a special event at my university, at Harvard University, a panel discussion on sustainable food. It took place in the storied faculty room in University Hall. The president of the university was there to lend importance to the moment. It was a panel discussion on sustainable food, and the three panelists, well, there weren't any agronomists, there weren't any animal scientists, there weren't even any agricultural economists. One panelist was a celebrity restaurateur from the San Francisco Bay Area. The second panelist was a playwright from New York. And the third panelist was a young Harvard graduate who was the head of Slow Food USA. It took this panel no time at all to reach a lockstep conclusion that the only sustainable food system in the future would have to be organic, local, and slow. And most of those in the room appeared to agree with this conclusion, judging from all the nodding of heads. But I just returned from a trip to rural Uganda, where I had been talking to real farmers trapped in an extreme version of exactly this kind of food system. They didn't know it, but they were living the Harvard dream. Even though they were all living in deep poverty, and 1/3 of them were chronically undernourished. These farmers were organic because they couldn't afford nitrogen fertilizer. Their food was local because the unimproved road system made it virtually impossible to move food around during the rainy season. Their food preparation system was painfully slow. These women farmers, after planting, cultivating, and harvesting the crop in order to make a meal for their family, they'd have to strip the maize and then pound the maize and then soak the maize and then dry the maize. And then they'd have to go fetch water and wood to build a fire, and then they could finally cook the meal. This was slow food that I thought the young graduate of Harvard University would rather do without. But today's vision of a farming system that is small farms, local farms, diverse farms, organic farms. This is a vision that manages somehow to present itself as progressive, even though it's literally reactionary, because this is what farming looked like 100 years ago here in the United States. And we're not going back, and we shouldn't go back. We left this kind of farming for good reasons. But the proponents of this alternative vision continue to see it as the way of the future. The uptake of these ideal visions has been disappointing so far. Organic food is undeniably popular with consumers, but not so much with commercial farmers, because they don't want to go back to producing crops without manufactured fertilizers. As a result, less than 1% of harvested cropland in the United States today is certified organic, less than 1%. Local food is also culturally popular, but it plays just a small role in the commercial marketplace, and in fact, it plays a diminishing role in the commercial marketplace. Less than 2% of fresh produce sales in the United States are made through local farmers markets. In fact, our food system isn't becoming more local, it's becoming more global. In the 1990s, 11% of our food was imported. Now that's 20%. Foodies also wants farms to be small and more diversified, but instead the trend is farms continue getting bigger and become more specialized. Internationally, the new food movement wants us to move toward two other visions: agroecology, farming that imitates nature, and food sovereignty, which is an approach that rejects globalization completely. These visions as well are simply not being taken up. They're culturally popular, but they're being rejected in the commercial marketplace, I think for good reasons. Why do the critics want to go in this different direction? It's because they have rejected what they see as industrial agriculture. They call modern farming industrial agriculture. One leading critic, Mark Bittman, a former columnist in the New York Times, put it very simply. He said, modern farming is warming the planet, polluting the environment, spawning an obesity crisis, and torturing animals. And frankly, quite a few of my students believe that that's true. I think this vision of industrial agriculture is coming from a badly outdated understanding of what modern farming consists of. Back in the 1960s and the 1970s, our commercial farms did use too much water. They did use too much fossil energy. They did apply too many chemicals. And these were the dumb and dirty commercial farms that inspired Rachel Carson to write her best-selling book, Silent Spring, back in 1962, that launched the modern environmental movement. It was a warning against the indiscriminate use of the insecticide DDT. But times have changed. Thanks to tighter environmental regulations beginning in the 1970s, partly thanks to Rachel Carson, plus rapid advances in farming technology, farming today is making a landmark pivot away from dumb and dirty toward being smart and clean. And we're making this pivot not by going back to pre-industrial methods. We're not going back to organic, local, and slow. We're actually moving in a post-industrial direction. We're going digital. We're incorporating sophisticated GPS guidance systems, soil maps, big data, onboard computers, and all the rest. Now, these changes are a little hard to see if you're just driving through farm country. Farms can still look largely industrial. Just last month, in fact, I had an opportunity to ride along with a fifth-generation Indiana corn farmer, John Neidlinger, in the buddy seat of his combine harvester, a 400 horsepower case combine harvester. This was a mechanical behemoth. It was stripping down corn rows a dozen at a time with mechanized uniformity. It looked like an industrial process. Of course, it wasn't an assembly line. It was more or less a disassembly line for those corn plants. But the bounty of the harvest did not emerge from an industrial process. The bounty of the harvest emerged from a biological process that was being tended with the latest information-intensive technologies in the most sophisticated way. John had planted his crop last spring using a GPS-steered 24-row planter that was pre-programmed by his son, J.D., to put down seeds with different spacing row by row and even within rows. Different spacing matched precisely to the variable elevation and water holding capacity of the soil in each separate part of the field. Critics of industrial farming say that it imposes uniformity on nature, but John's machine, his planter, was delivering a continuously variable seeding pattern that conformed to the variable needs of nature. The secret to the spatial precision was John's own RTK Base Station. That's real-time kinematics. It's a base station that logs the small errors contained in incoming GPS satellite data and sends correction signals either through radio or cellular modem to the roving field equipment to correct those small errors. This makes it possible to know the exact position of a planter in the field in real time with sub-inch accuracy in a cornfield. And John, later in the season, fertilized his corn with the same kind of tailored variability. Instead of spreading uniform quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus and potash, the equipment puts these chemicals down at a variable rate based on previously mapped variations in soil chemistry. And John also uses tissue samples of his plants' while they're growing, as they mature, to determine whether some additional nitrogen or maybe some treatment for a fungus might be optimal in this part of the field, but not that part over here, but not over there. In order to add nitrogen to a mature 8-foot-tall cornfield, you need special equipment. You need a high-clearance sprayer with skinny tires and with a boom that moves above the plants. But from that boom, John hangs something called a Y-drop, which is a system of rubber and metal hoses that hang to the ground and dribble nitrogen at a variable rate right by the roots of the plant. Then the dew that drips off the leaves will send the nitrogen into the soil at exactly the right rate, in accordance with measured needs. This is precision agriculture, and the payoff for John is much lower nitrogen costs. Since the 1980s, John has reduced his nitrogen use per bushel of corn production by 30 to 40%. Of course, the payoff for the environment is less runoff into the local water system. Now, critics like Mark Bittman see industrial farming as unsustainable. But if you look at the national trend data, the opposite seems to be the case. Look at corn production. Since 1940, corn production in the United States has increased 5-fold, and yet the land area planted to corn has decreased by 20%. Growing 5 times as much on 20% less land is a good way to save the land and to protect wildlife habitat. Modern farming, everyone says, oh, it's chemical intensive, but it's brought down chemical use. Total fertilizer use in American farming peaked in 1981, and it's been essentially flat since then, even though production has increased by 44%. We've seen a similar pattern with the use of chemical pesticides. And for insecticides specifically, that's what troubled Rachel Carson, was insecticides. Total use of insecticides in American farming peaked in 1972, and it has now fallen 82% since then. This starts to look like sustainable farming to me, not like unsustainable industrial farming. Critics like to describe modern farming as resource intensive, but it's going in the other direction. Look at some crop-by-crop comparisons. For wheat production since 1980, and that's really when this turn became most pronounced, land use per bushel of production fallen by 22%, irrigation water down 20%, energy use per bushel down 22%, greenhouse gas emissions per bushel down 9%, soil loss per acre down 28%. For corn, the reduction percentage is minus 41% for land per bushel, minus 46% for irrigation water used per bushel, minus 41% for energy use, minus 31% for greenhouse gas emissions, minus 58% for soil loss per acre. And similar trends can be seen for cotton, potatoes, rice, soybeans, and sugar beets. So the unsustainable production dimension of this problem is something that I think comes from an outdated look at the evidence. Instead of the environmental problems in industrial farming, some critics like to look instead at dietary issues. This is a big issue for foodies, literally. Their biggest complaint about modern agriculture is that it has given us an unhealthy industrial diet. Since the 1960s, it's true, the share of Americans that are clinically obese with a body mass index above 30 has tripled to reach 40%. Let me say that again. 40% of adult Americans are now clinically obese. So there's no denying the magnitude of the problem. It's a public health emergency. The prevalence of diabetes in the United States is now 12 times as high as it was in 1958. Nearly half of U.S. deaths today caused by heart disease, stroke, and diabetes can be traced to poor diets. In fact, about twice as many Americans now die each year from eating processed meats like hot dogs as die in automobile accidents. So we cannot pretend that we don't face a healthy eating crisis in America. The critics say Aggies are to blame for some of this. Farmers are to blame because they produce too many commodity crops like corn and soy, crops that are heavily used in junk foods, or crops that are used like corn to sweeten sugary beverages, crops that are used as feed for animals to give us all of those hot dogs. We grow too many energy-dense commodity crops, and we don't grow enough fresh fruits and vegetables. And we can't deny this either. There's no denying that production patterns in the United States are skewed in this direction. But we have to immediately point out that what American farmers produce does not dictate what the American people consume. Look at corn. More than 30% of our corn production leaves the food supply entirely and goes for the production of ethanol for auto fuel. Another 14% of our corn crop is exported, so it leaves the food supply, at least in the United States. Look at soybeans. More than 60% of the soybeans we produce are exported, despite the little trade war that we've fallen into recently. And meanwhile, the things that we don't produce enough of at home are being abundantly imported. The United States now imports more than half of its fresh fruit consumption, more than half. And I'm glad that we do. Otherwise, it'd be hard for me to get fresh fruit in New England in the winter months. We import almost a third of our fresh vegetables. We import 80% of our fish. So we have increased per capita availability of fruits, vegetables, and fish on the market, even though these things are not being produced by farmers in the United States. There's a wisdom in this kind of specialization, particularly in a world where different agroclimatic regions are better suited to some things than to producing others. But critics say, don't farm subsidies make food artificially cheap in the United States, leading us to consume too much, and that's why we're obese. Well, this is actually one of the most firmly believed farm facts that my students enter class convinced of, and it's unfortunately mistaken as well. Farm subsidies are designed to increase the income of farmers, but they generally do this by pushing farm commodity prices up rather than down. Look at sugar, which is excessively consumed by 2/3 of Americans, maybe even some people in this room. We would be consuming even more sugar if the federal government didn't use tariff rate quotas to block cheap sugar imports from the outside world. Between 1982 and 2012, because of import restrictions, the price of sugar inside the U.S. market averaged 64% above the international price. So we have an expensive sugar policy, not a cheap sugar policy. We also push up wheat prices by paying farmers in states like Kansas to take some of their land out of production under the Conservation Reserve program. But corn is the crop that the foodies complain about the most. Back in 2006, Michael Pollan, the author of Omnivore's Dilemma, complained that America was suffering from a plague of cheap corn. And his followers went on to produce popular films like King Corn in 2007 and Food Inc. in 2009 that advanced this same conclusion. Food Inc. was nominated for an Academy Award. But, of course, instead of making food artificially cheap, we actually make corn, instead of making corn artificially cheap, we make it artificially expensive by mandating that a large part of the crop be diverted for the production of fuel ethanol. As of 2018, 38% of the entire U.S. corn crop was going for fuel ethanol. Now, some came back as distillers' grains for feed, but still more than 30% of our corn goes to fuel, leaves the food supply completely, and that drives up the price of corn instead of down. Another problem with the popular narrative about cheap corn and soy is the forgotten distinction between farm commodity prices on the one hand and final retail prices paid by food consumers on the other hand. Only 12% of the final food retail price today can be traced back to farms. The other 88% of the retail price that we pay for food goes to food processing, to packaging, to transport, to wholesale, to retail, to advertising, to energy, to finance, to insurance, and to the restaurant sector. So if food is expensive or cheap in the United States, the first place to look isn't to the farm. It's to the 88% of our food system that's downstream from farms. In fact, it's when we look at our unhealthy diets, it's downstream from farms where most of the problems arise. Our manufactured food products in supermarkets have addictive quantities, frankly, addictive quantities of added sugar and salt. And they're now ubiquitously available. And they often require virtually no preparation time and no cleanup time beyond throwing away the packaging. I mean, in my academic life, I used to be able to go to a seminar at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there wouldn't be a buffet spread out in the room. Now it's everywhere. I think the Coca-Cola Company has as one of its corporate dreams where a Coke is only a wish away or something like that. They want to have a bottle of Coca-Cola absolutely everywhere. So if you have the slightest urge, it's at hand. That's the way food manufacturing companies market their products. And they do market their products directly through supermarkets, of course, through slotting fees and through the money that they pay the retailers to put the Doritos on the end cap conveniently close to checkout so that whim purchases will be made of their product rather than some other product. But I would insist, these unhealthy food temptations, the ones that lead to our obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, they come from food companies and restaurant chains, not from farms, and not from farm subsidies. So I wish the leaders of our new food movement would focus a little bit less on farming. Is it organic or not? Is it local or not? Is it diverse or not? And spend a little more time looking at food manufacturing and food retailing and the chain restaurant industry. These are the institutions that are flooding our market with the foods that we don't really need, and many of which are not good for our health. But getting back to industrial agriculture, some foodie complaints about industrial agriculture, I think, are legitimate. They're well-grounded, particularly when it comes to the, I think, needless mistreatment of farm animals. Our tight confinement of pigs and of egg-laying hens is good for productivity, and it's possibly even good for environmental protection, given the quantity of product that the market is now demanding. But the welfare of the animals tends to go neglected. In the past half century, we've created indoor concentrated animal feeding operations as a way to lower labor costs, maintain better feeding control, reduce animal exposure to predators and temperature extremes. But the confinement can impose serious physical, social, and emotional cost on the animals. For example, pregnant sows and egg-laying hens that are caged in spaces so small that they can't turn around. Now, Jason Lusk and Bailey Norwood, two economists that I respect, examined different ways to measure farm animal welfare. Several years ago, wrote a book in which they concluded that most of our egg-laying hens had a negative quality of life, They said this plausibly implies that they might be better off dead. We have to take these concerns seriously, particularly because there are more humane ways to raise meat animals without going all the way back to the barnyard and pasture systems of the past. These older barnyard and pasture systems are widely promoted by the food movement, but they're far too expensive. For example, if you look at the rotational grazing system used by Joel Salatin of Polyface Farm in Virginia, this is an operation celebrated by Michael Pollan in his book Omnivore's Dilemma. Salatin gives us boneless, skinless chicken breasts that cost $14 a pound, which is about 5 times the supermarket price. This is not going to scale up anytime soon. And you can't get it in the supermarket. You have to go pick it up at a scheduled pickup spot once a week. But we don't have to return animals to pasture. For a much smaller increase in production costs, we can give confined animals a far better quality of life than they have now. 3 weeks ago, I was at a meeting in the Netherlands, and I decided to sneak off to visit a Dutch pig farm in North Holland. It was a modern Dutch pig farm with 4,000 animals. From the outside, the barns looked similar to something you might see in Iowa or Minnesota. But inside the barns, the European Union and Dutch national law now enforce strict rules to protect pig welfare. For example, there are minimum space requirements per pig, pro-weighted to the weight of the pig as it grows. There must be a minimum area of continuous floor, not just slatted floors. Pregnant sows must be in group housing with no individual gestation crates. There must be a thermally comfortable area big enough to allow all the animals to lie down at the same time. There are limits, decibel limits to noise levels, and lighting above a minimum level is required for at least 8 hours a day. To fight boredom, these are intelligent animals. To fight boredom, the pigs must have permanent access to what is called material to enable proper investigation and manipulation activities. They don't call them toys, but pigs must have toys. I talked to one animal scientist in the Netherlands who said when the government switched to this regulation, in order to get everyone comfortable with it, they actually had a competition where the top artists in the country were invited to design toys for pigs. And they came up with some fabulous toys that the pigs loved, but they weren't economical. Maybe some manufactured version of these toys will catch on sooner or later. But in the Netherlands, they take these things seriously. I like to laugh at these things at first, but the more I think about it, the more I think that this is an all-evolved understanding of what these animals actually need. In addition, in swine production in the Netherlands, interventions like tail docking or the castration of male pigs must be carried out by trained personnel or by veterinarians. Now, of course, these things are expensive, and pig production costs in the European Union are undeniably higher than in the United States. But I would point out that in spite of these higher costs, the European Union collectively produces twice as much pork as the United States. This has not stopped them from being bigger pig farmers than we are. And their higher costs are primarily linked to feed costs, to energy costs, and to labor costs, not to the costs of enhanced housing. So U.S. producers could move in Europe's direction on the animal welfare front and still retain a significant international cost advantage. And unsurprisingly, this is slowly happening because of social concerns for this issue. The Humane Society, which campaigns for animal welfare, has already, through ballot measures and by pressuring state legislatures, secured sow gestation crate bans in Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Maine, Michigan, Ohio, and Rhode Island. They have secured battery cage bans for egg-laying hens in California, Michigan, Ohio, Oregon, and Washington. And you may have noticed that just 2 days ago in California, the Humane Society was successful in another ballot proposition, Proposition 12, that set new minimum floor space requirements for veal calves and for egg-laying hens and for pregnant pigs. In addition, more than 60 companies, including McDonald's, Burger King, Oscar Mayer, Costco, and Kroger, have now promised to sell only crate-free pork in the near future, and Whole Foods Market and Chipotle have already taken that step. And there are market rewards for doing this. Last month, I visited a breed to wean pig operation in southern Indiana, where a very progressive farmer had decided to go to group housing for pregnant sows, 10 to a pen, and he did it in part because he can get a premium in the market. The meat from his piglets can be sold as from a crate-free production system, and that gives him a market premium. Now, of course, the number of animals experiencing mistreatment on our farms in the much longer run might also be reduced if we shift towards simulated products made from vegetable ingredients or cell tissues grown in labs. And thanks to today's scientists, these products are getting better all the time. One company, Impossible Foods, has used molecular science to give us, since 2016, a plant-based burger that remains pink on the inside when it's broiled. And the molecule that does this, the heme molecule, also gives it that slightly metallic taste that you expect to have when you eat a real hamburger. And the Impossible Burger leaks juice, leaks red juice. So it's only a matter of time before products such as these will replace actual animals without disappointing those who like the taste and the feel of these kinds of products. Already, plant-based soy, almond, and rice milk have taken over 9.3% of the dairy market. But that's an over-the-horizon response. In the end, I give industrial agriculture, which, as I say, is becoming rapidly post-industrial, a mixed but a generally positive scorecard. And yet, communicating such a scorecard across the foodie Aggie cultural divide can be difficult. And if I may say so, our own agricultural leaders don't always make it easier. First, these leaders sometimes like to brag a little bit too much. They got a lot to brag about, but it's not helpful to be so self-congratulatory in our current political environment. Last spring in the Farm Bill debate, Representative Mike Conaway from Texas, who is the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, said, he's now the outgoing chair of the House Agriculture Committee, he observed, Americans enjoy the safest, most abundant and affordable, Americans enjoy the safest, most abundant and affordable food supply of any developed nation in the world. And that is true. That is technically true. But this kind of talk doesn't do anything to persuade the critics of modern industrial agriculture, because it ignores our obesity crisis, and it ignores continuing pollution problems, and farm labor problems, and farm animal welfare problems. A better strategy for agricultural leaders is to avoid self-congratulation, acknowledge the critics, maintain a sense of humor, and have your facts ready at hand. For example, at a so-called Food for Tomorrow conference that was organized by the New York Times in 2014, just outside of New York, food activists like Mark Bittman and Michael Pollan were dominating the discussion. But they were disarmed at one point by a Midwestern pork producer who cheerfully introduced herself as the part of big ag you were taught to hate. Then she went on to share facts about modern livestock production that have never been printed in the New York Times, and yet were of great interest to an urban audience. And by the end of the conference, Mark Bittman's tone had changed from a declaration of war on agriculture — that's how he started the conference — to a more yielding recognition that, quote, we all want the same thing. I'm not sure we all want the same thing, but he had to tone down his message when he encountered someone with a well-constructed counter approach. There are some other proven ways that will allow agricultural leaders to narrow the foodie agricultural divide. One approach, called Adopt a Legislator, was pioneered by the Farm Bureau in Illinois. This program encourages downstate Farm Bureau leaders in Illinois to identify upstate legislators in Chicago and then invite them, along with some of their constituents, for reciprocal farm and city visits and tours. And this does a great deal to break down stereotypes and to build personal relationships. And even the biggest farms in America tend to be family-run. And urban legislators who visit these farms may not understand the production systems, but they usually come away deeply impressed with the family values that inspire all of the hard work. But this won't be enough. Aggies trying to communicate with foodies are also going to need to show a little more active concern for the healthy eating issue. And one place they might start would be to reconsider the mostly uncritical support that commodity producers have traditionally given to food manufacturing companies out of a kind of a cultural solidarity or rural solidarity. The food companies usually get included in the larger family of rural agrarian America. But remember, these companies are quite often taking the healthful commodities that are grown on farms and turning them into commercial products of dubious nutritional value. I think it's for good reason that many of these companies are under attack from healthy food activists. So why are so many farm organizations still defending them and even allowing them to use farmers for their own political cover? As just one example of this, last January at the Farm Bureau Convention meeting in Nashville, there was a public forum, and the Farm Bureau had invited as its lead guest on this forum the president and CEO of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is a trade organization that represents food and beverage manufacturing companies. And this guest told her audience of farmers, your harvest becomes our product. Well, yes, but with a little bit of sugar and salt and some preservatives and fat and colorants added. She then went on to make another interesting claim. She said, we are the link between you and the consumer in the cities. We work together to tell the story of American agriculture. And I thought to myself, as our nation's obesity crisis worsens, American farmers shouldn't want their story to be told by the companies that are manufacturing and selling Doritos or sugar frosted flakes or Pepsi-Cola to their kids. I think the Aggie community would do well to distance itself from food companies that sometimes try to boost their reputation by claiming to represent farmers. It would be better for agricultural leaders, I think, to look beyond the food companies, to jump over the food companies and reach out directly to those in the healthy eating community. For example, I believe the Farm Bureau, or maybe the Farm Foundation, should have offered conspicuous and explicit support to First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative. This would have been a wonderful opportunity to show that farmers are also concerned about childhood obesity. I believe they should have supported the school menu reforms contained in the 2010 Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act. And in the most recent 2018 Farm Bill debate, which may turn into a 2019 Farm Bill debate, we don't know yet. In this debate, agricultural leaders might have supported an initiative led by two former Secretaries of Agriculture, Republican Ann Veneman and Democrat Dan Glickman, and supported by the American Heart Association, a proposal to remove sugary beverages from eligibility for purchase in the SNAP food stamp program. As long as our farm organizations fail to support these ideas, we shouldn't be too surprised if the Foodies conclude that Big Ag is working with Big Food to sell product that doesn't necessarily protect a healthy diet. So U.S. commodity organizations, and also I think the leadership of our land-grant universities, might be doing themselves a great favor. It would enhance their national reputation outside of their own sector if they began making more vocal commitments to the cause of healthy eating, calling on food companies to accelerate the reformulation of their products and to accelerate the restriction of their advertising practices in front of children. This is no longer a radical position to take. It's something the companies are being forced to do anyway under pressure from health-conscious consumers. So on the healthy eating issue, I think it's time for agriculture to get on the winning side while there's still time. So let me close now by I think we promised a compromise for a new food system. I'm not sure I promised that compromise, but I got to come up with one. So let me close by describing a vision for America's farming future that I would hope both Foodies and Aggies could support. It's not an either-or vision, but it's not a homogenized compromise either. When it comes to commercial food production, I believe it's inevitable that our food production system will remain industrial and will continue to evolve even in a post-industrial direction rather than going back to a pre-industrial direction. I mean, currently, 87% of our production comes from larger farms with annual sales above $150,000. We have a large farm food production system, and I think it's going to remain that way. This is where production is going to come from. But while 87% of our food comes from that system, 85% of our farms in America aren't a part of that sales class category. Industrial farms may be commercially dominant, but they don't They're not demographically or culturally dominant. The vast majority of our farms, and hence the vast majority of our farmers, are smaller commercial operations, part-time farms, retirement farms, hobby farms, getting most of their income from the non-farm economy, lifestyle farms. These farmers grow very little of our food. Only 13% of our food comes from these farms. But they live on the land. They make large contributions to the social and cultural health of rural America. So I say, what's not to like about this kind of coexistence between two very different kinds of farming? It allows our large specialized farms to do what they do best, which is to supply most of our production and to do it at the lowest economic cost, and I believe also the lowest environmental cost, while it leaves space, plenty of space, for smaller farmers with off-farm income, who are now outnumbering the big farms 5-1. It allows them space to remain on the land and help populate rural communities without having to compete head-to-head in the commodity production space. This is it's a compromise vision of, I'd call it multi-agriculturalism, and I think it's one that both Foodies and Aggies would be able to embrace. So Sam, thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Well, like any good speaker, if you were a foodie or an Aggie, there were nuggets that you probably were saying in your mind, yes, and others you were probably saying, maybe. At this time, we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. If you're remote, please speak to your moderator to type in the comment box, and we'll get those questions out. If you are here in Athens, in our live audience, if you'll just raise your hand, our ambassadors that have their red jackets on will bring a microphone to you. So there's a small prize to the first person who wants to. Hey, come on, it worked in my class. It's got to work with you. Any questions for Dr. Paarlberg? Yeah, can we get a mic?
Hi, I actually agreed with nearly everything you said. I didn't have that many maybes. Was interested, though, you talked about a lot of the big issues in this conflict. Didn't talk at all about biotech. I was just wondering where that fits into the argument and the compromise.
Yes, that's going to be very difficult to find an effective compromise. I talked about all of the foodie visions that haven't scaled up. Organic hasn't scaled up, local hasn't scaled up, agroecology hasn't scaled up, food sovereignty hasn't scaled up, diversity hasn't scaled up. Actually, it's agricultural biotechnology, particularly applications of transgenic techniques to food crops in particular, that has been a spectacular success. The food movement has been victorious across the board. We use transgenic techniques for a lot of industrial crops, like cotton or corn ethanol, and for feed crops like corn and soybeans. But there are almost no food crops for direct human consumption being grown anywhere in the world, even in the United States, using GMO technologies. The United States, even the United States doesn't plant GMO wheat. Even the United States doesn't plant GMO rice. In fact, nobody around the world plants GMO wheat or GMO rice. The only GMO food crops for direct human consumption being grown, well, let's see, some papaya in Hawaii, some white maize in South Africa, tiny bits of eggplant in Bangladesh, some summer squash, a little bit of sweet corn, but it's been driven out of the food supply almost completely. And this raises a forward-looking concern for agricultural scientists and for those who want to bring technology improvements to developing countries in particular. course, biotechnology has moved on. We're now deep into a gene editing revolution with CRISPR-Cas9 and other techniques. And there had been hope that these techniques would not be classified as GMO and would not fall under the same stifling blanket of regulatory restrictions and the same stigmatizing criticism as GMOs. The United States, Canada, Sweden wanted to go ahead and treat gene-edited crops not like GMOs, but like conventionally developed crops. And even top authorities in Europe wanted to do that as well. But last summer, the European Court of Justice, responding to a suit from Greenpeace and a French farmers organization, decided that gene-edited crops in Europe would have to be considered as GMOs and would have to be regulated like GMOs. So that means labeling, tracing, segregation, all the rest. And if this decision stands, we're going to have a whole new generation of transatlantic trade conflicts before we've decided what to do with gene-edited crops. And that's going to be a big loss for farmers in Africa who are already interested in gene-edited varieties of staple food crops. If Europe doesn't want these things, maybe the Africans are going to hesitate there just as they have on transgenic crops. Sorry, I can't be more optimistic.
Thank you.
So I'm very interested in your comments on biodiversity and that isn't scaling up. And I get the sense that you don't feel like that's an important thing that we need to be dealing with. But you also are arguing for healthy eating. We need more fresh fruits and vegetables. We know that the lack of landscape diversity and farm diversity, at least in some parts of the country, are severely impacting pollinators and beneficial insects. So which we desperately need to pollinate those fruits and vegetables. So I feel like you've sort of given that a short end of the stick. So you want to comment on that, please?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a fair criticism. I didn't spend enough time thinking about that or speaking about it. Biodiversity is very important to me. I guess the question is how much of that biodiversity should be incorporated farm by farm. Should farms be specialized, or should each separate farm have fruit crops, vegetable crops, commodity grains, livestock? Should each separate farm be an imitation of a nutrient cycling system and have multiple different species? I'm a little skeptical about that model. If you consider biodiversity as the number of different animal species and plant varieties being planted on farms or raised on farms, biodiversity in the industrial agricultural world has actually been increasing, according to the OECD. Total number of different varieties and species in production has been going up, not down. I'm sure there are special landscape problems in some parts of modern industrial agriculture because of excessive specialization, and the pollinator question I need to learn more about. So I appreciate that reminder. I worry though because some people think that organic farming provides a natural alternative to specialized industrial farming, and it doesn't. Of course, most organically grown crops are grown on large, specialized industrial scale operations in California that are virtually clones of conventional industrial scale farms. They may not use manufactured fertilizer, and they may control weeds with flamethrowers instead of herbicides. But in terms of biological diversity, they're not an improvement in my view.
In the back.
Hi. What are your thoughts on the use of biofertilizers and their feasibility in scaling into an industrial agricultural system?
I don't know enough about that issue to give you an answer, and I'm not going to guess in front of a large crowd. But you maybe do know quite a bit about it, so this is your chance to give me a 3-sentence summary of your thoughts.
All right, so biofertilizers are basically the use of microbial, microbes will fix various, phosphates and nitrogen into the soil instead of the use of actual fertilizer, which helps in the long term cost-wise as well, because you don't have to keep adding fertilizer. So that may be a potential solution in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I know that one of the holy grails of crop breeding is to build nodules onto plants that will fix nitrogen, plants that don't now have those nodules. That's a worthy project for the 21st century.
Do we have any questions from our remote audience, Regina, yet? Okay. We've got time. I think we'll do a couple more. Got one in the middle in the back here, folks. Get him a microphone. Isn't it refreshing, though, you have a speaker who actually says, I don't know? Because most of the time when I listen to people, they are really convinced and sure that they know absolutely everything. So I appreciate Dr. Paarlberg making that comment.
What do you see as a solution to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's largely caused by fertilizer runoff?
Yeah, in fact, I think it is now as large as it's ever been since monitoring began. So this is a problem that has not gone away. And we obviously, maybe the corn farmer that I visited in northeastern Indiana has cut his nitrogen use by 30 to 40% per bushel of production since the 1980s. But not everyone has done that well. And his watershed goes into Lake Erie, not into the Gulf of Mexico. And Lake Erie has problems, especially with phosphorus. So there are chemical problems galore that are still unsolved. The one major body of water that seems to be doing visibly better is the Chesapeake Bay, where oxygen levels are coming under control and water clarity is improving. The nitrogen use problem in the Gulf of Mexico is a particularly difficult one because there are so many different states in the watershed, and the regulation of nitrogen use almost has to be a state-by-state problem, and getting all those states to coordinate is terribly difficult. Increasingly, of course, farmers are putting drains in their fields, and those drains, depending upon weather conditions and depending upon how much nitrogen they apply, can accelerate a runoff into water systems downstream, and we don't quite know how to regulate those things yet. We thought at one point, oh, well, the price of nitrogen is just going to go so high that farmers will stop using it, but they're still using it. As I say, they're not using it more than in the past. They're growing 44% more, using as much as they used in 1981, but that's still a heavy use, and it's adding to an accumulation of damage from the past that leaves us with an unsolved problem.
So, oh, you went first, Jason. You can go.
Maybe two more,
Okay.
if they're quick.
Okay, so I just have a question about soil conservation and long-term sustainability, because most, if not all, of our farming systems they're ultimately using up their supply of soil. Even some of the best conservation agriculture is just slowing down the rate of loss rather than actually replenishing it. And it seems that any system where that's the case is ultimately doomed to be unsustainable in the long run, because you're going to run out of soil eventually, or at least good soil. So I'm wondering, what is there in this area to try to boost that up, or maybe even take an economic point of view of treating soil as a resource that it actually has value before it gets to the point where it's too late?
Yeah, of course, all soil conservation problems are highly local, like politics, and it's difficult to provide a generic response to the soil protection problem. On balance, in United States agriculture, soil is far better protected today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, in large part because of a move toward no-till farming, which was initially stimulated by high energy prices in the 1970s. Farmers couldn't afford to burn the diesel fuel that was required to plow their fields, so they innovated ways to plant seeds through the stubble from last year's crop and saved all that diesel fuel. They realized that also then sequestered carbon and retained soil moisture and did a lot of other good things, and it became a new way of farming. And you're right, conservation farming is now more widespread in developing countries as well. We're learning how to extend low tillage, minimum tillage, zero tillage methods even into tropical countries where problems with weeds can be more acute. I think the data suggest that we're going in the right direction with soil protection. The data suggest to me that if there's something unsustainable about modern farming, it's probably not soil loss. The greatest soil loss comes not from modern farming systems, but from the extension of traditional farming systems onto unplowed ground. In Africa today, where crop yields are low and barely increasing, but population and food requirements are increasing, the only way to produce the food that's needed is to cut down more forest, destroy more wildlife habitat, move up the watershed, plow up grazing lands, graze drier lands, and those are the practices that are doing the most around the world to damage soil. I think not the careful soil management practices that have spread widely in the United States. The farmer whose corn harvest I witnessed earlier this fall also plants cover crops, something that has long been done and is being done more widely today. It's a good part of soil management practices.
Well, thank you, Rob. We have a small token, and I'm hoping it'll fit in your bag on the airplane. But we have a cutting board that's made from, I've been told, all Georgia wood products. So I don't know if anybody's from forestry's here, but
Thank you very much.
we'll get you a bag here. And there's some coasters. Well, for us today is always a special day in the year of the college. Certainly for our college family, it's where we take a step back and we look and think about what we do on a daily basis, not only here in Georgia, but around the world. Hopefully it's a time that we'll think and we'll debate and we'll ultimately come hopefully to a consensus on what the next big idea and what the inspiration that we need to move forward will be. I want to thank you all for coming, and there is a reception out in the lobby area, and I hope that you'll be able to congratulate our winners of the D.W. Brooks Awards, as well as have a further opportunity to chat with Dr. Paarlberg. So the doors are going to open up. If you don't eat and drink something, graduate students are going to get more obese. Thank you.